In the autumn of 1887, in the raw-boned settlement of Providence, nestled in the vast and unforgiving Dakota Territory, the currency of a man was the sound of his axe. A sharp, rhythmic chop meant progress. A steady, sawing hum meant shelter. The scent of fresh-cut pine was the smell of foresight, of a family that would see the spring. But from the small plot of land at the far edge of the settlement, deeded to the quiet Norwegian immigrant Elias Lund, came a different set of sounds. There was the expected ring of the axe, yes, but it was punctuated by long, contemplative silences. There were the sounds of planing and fitting, but they were slower, more deliberate, almost maddeningly precise. The men of Providence, led by the master builder of the territory, Jedediah Thorne, built with the confidence of experience. Their cabins were monuments to brute force. Thick, hastily hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, rose from the prairie floor. They were sturdy, solid, and identical. They were built on the principle that to defeat the Dakota winter, one must build a fortress of wood and raise a roaring fire within it. It was a simple, declarative statement against the cold. Elias Lund was a man carved from a different wood. He was tall and spare, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a silence that was often mistaken for simplicity. He had arrived a year prior with his wife, Lena, whose laughter had been a small, bright flower in the harsh landscape. But the previous winter, a mild one by all accounts, had taken her with a fever that burned through their modest, temporary shelter. Now, Elias was alone, and his grief was a silent companion, a weight in his shoulders, a pause before every swing of his axe. He was not building a cabin, he was building a vow, a promise to a memory that the cold would never again steal the warmth from his home. The other settlers saw him as an object of pity, and soon, of ridicule. He was an outsider, a man whose accent was as thick as his methods were strange. He spent weeks selecting his trees, walking the small wooded creek bed behind his property, laying a hand on the bark of ancient cottonwoods and straight, proud pines. He did not take the biggest, but the densest, tapping them with the butt of his axe, listening for a deep, solid resonance that only he seemed to understand. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose beard was as square as his jaw, made a point of stopping by Elias's claim one crisp October afternoon. Thorne was the undisputed authority on construction. He had built the church, the land office, and nearly every cabin in the settlement. His approval was a stamp of legitimacy. He found Elias not raising walls, but digging. He was excavating a shallow, rectangular pit before the spot where his front door would be, lining it carefully with flat river stones he'd hauled from the creek. "Lund!" Thorne's voice boomed, carrying the easy weight of command. "Winter's coming on. A man in your position should be getting his walls up, not playing with pebbles." Elias looked up, his face impassive. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, though the air was sharp with cold. "I am building, Master Thorne." Thorne snorted, a plume of white vapor erupting from his nostrils. He gestured at the neatly stacked, meticulously debarked and planed logs nearby. "Your wood is pretty enough for a lady's sewing box, but it's the raising that matters. What's this folly?" He nudged the stone-lined pit with his boot. "A root cellar at your front stoop? You'll break your neck in the dark." "It is for the entrance," Elias said, his English careful and deliberate. Thorne's apprentice, a young man named Silas, stifled a laugh. Thorne did not. "The entrance? An entrance is a hole in the wall with a door to fill it. Nothing more. You're wasting time. That wind, when it comes, won't care how pretty your stones are." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the pit. "Mark my words. The first blizzard will scour this place clean. You need thick walls, a good stove, and a mountain of cordwood. That is how a man survives here." Elias said nothing, merely watched as Thorne and his apprentice walked away, their confident laughter echoing back to him. He looked down at the stones, at the memory of his grandfather's hands, gnarled and strong, laying a similar foundation in the biting cold of the Jotunheimen mountains. He heard the old man's voice, a low rumble like shifting rock. Men think the enemy is the cold. The enemy is movement. Stop the air, and you stop the cold. That was the knowledge he carried, not from a book, not from a plan, but from generations of living in a place where winter was not a season, but a god. The settlers of Providence saw the cold as an invading army to be met with the fire and fury of a blazing stove. His grandfather had taught him it was more like water. It did not need to be fought, but to be channeled, to be understood, to be given a place to rest before it could enter. He began to build. His cabin rose more slowly than the others. The logs were fitted with a precision that Thorne's crews, paid by the day, would have called wasteful. He used a Scandinavian saddle notch, a complex, self-tightening joint that left almost no gap for the wind. He did not chink with mud, which would crack and fall away. He spent days gathering sphagnum moss, drying it, and then packing it into the seams with a wooden mallet and a thin, flexible blade of iron. It was a living seal, one that would swell with moisture and tighten its grip. But it was the entrance that drew the most scorn. He built a small, box-like extension, no bigger than a closet, protruding from the front of the cabin. It had its own small roof, its own sturdy walls. It had a frame for a door on its outer wall and another frame for a door on the inner wall, leading into the cabin proper. A double door. The mockery was no longer subtle. Men would go out of their way to pass his claim, to point and chuckle. "He's building a house for his house," one said. "Wasting good wood on 2 doors when one is trouble enough," another declared. Thorne himself made another visit, this time with a small coterie of the town's elders. He stood before the strange wooden box, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. "Lund," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I feel it is my Christian duty to inform you that you are building your own tomb. This contraption is a wind trap. The snow will pack in there until you can't open either door. You'll be sealed in. Or the wind will catch that ridiculous little roof and peel the whole front of your cabin off." An elder, Mr. Hemlock, the owner of the general store, nodded sagely. "The boy's right, son. It's foolishness, torn from some old country fairy tale. This is the Dakotas. We build strong. We build simple." "It is a sen," Elias said, the Norwegian word feeling foreign and strange on his tongue. "A place for the winter to wait." The men exchanged glances. It was worse than they thought. The man was not just foolish, he was a poet, and poetry could not stop a norther. "Call it what you will," Thorne said, turning to leave. "I call it folly. When you're burning your furniture for warmth come January, don't come to me for lumber. My conscience is clear. I warned you." The sentence had been passed. Elias Lund was condemned by the collected wisdom of Providence. He was the fool on the edge of town, building his folly. He ignored them. He worked from the first gray light of dawn until his hands were too numb and the darkness too complete to see. He channeled his grief into the grain of the wood, into the heft of the stones. Every precise cut was a memory of Lena's smile. Every tightly packed seam of moss was a bulwark against the fever that had stolen her. This cabin was not just a shelter, it was an argument. It was his quiet, solitary rebuttal to a cruel and indifferent world. He began the doors. The outer door was a beast. He fashioned it from 2 layers of thick pine planks, laid perpendicular to each other for strength, and insulated the space between with raw, lanolin-rich wool he'd traded from a passing sheep farmer. He planed the edges to a fine, sharp bevel. He forged his own hinges, long and heavy straps of black iron that would not sag. He designed it to open outwards, not inwards. This was a critical detail his mockers could not grasp. The immense pressure of a winter wind would not force this door open. It would press it tighter into its frame, sealing it shut. For the frame itself, he carved a groove and lined it with strips of rabbit fur, the soft hairs forming a perfect, unbroken gasket against the wind. The inner door was different. It was lighter, made of a single layer of wood, but just as meticulously fitted. It opened inwards, into the main room of the cabin. Between the two doors was the space they all mocked, the Seine. It was barely 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide. The floor was the cold river stone he had laid. There were pegs on the walls for hanging a coat or a hat. It was a room of transition. A pause. The physics were simple, elegant, and born of brutal experience. When the outer door was opened, the blast of Arctic air would pour into the small, unheated Seine. It would swirl and settle on the stone floor, a cold sink that would absorb the initial shock. Then the outer door would be closed, trapping that pocket of winter. Only then would the inner door be opened, allowing entry into the cabin. The main living space would never be exposed directly to the outside. The exchange of air would be minimal, gentle. The precious, hard-won heat from the stove would remain where it belonged, inside. He finished his work in late November. The first snows had already dusted the prairie. His cabin did not look like the others. It was lower to the ground, with a steeply pitched roof to shed snow. The windows were small and few, and from the front, the strange, cubical Seine gave it the appearance of a watchful, brooding creature. His woodpile was smaller than his neighbors. This was perhaps the most damning evidence of his foolishness. A small woodpile on the plains was not a sign of efficiency. It was a sign of a man who had already given up. Winter came. It began subtly, with a hardening of the ground and a sharpening of the wind. Then the snows arrived in earnest, piling in deep, soft drifts. The temperature dropped. The world of Providence shrank to the space between the cabin and the woodpile. The days became a cycle of feeding the fire, a desperate, constant battle to pour heat into structures that leaked it from 1,000 invisible cracks. Inside Master Thorne's own cabin, a model of conventional wisdom, the fight was constant. His home was the largest in the settlement, a testament to his skill. But its single, massive oak door, a source of pride, was its greatest weakness. It was sealed with the best felt strips money could buy, but against the relentless pressure of the wind, it was not enough. A constant, razor-thin line of frost traced its edges. Every time it was opened to fetch wood or water, a visible hurricane of frigid air would tornado into the room, sending ashes puffing from the stove and driving his wife and children back from the hearth. The heat would drain from the room in a gasp. The cast-iron stove, a magnificent, roaring beast, had to be fed a steady diet of oak and ash just to keep the interior above freezing. Thorne found himself making more and more trips to his woodpile, his pride eroding with each armload. Elias, in his folly, experienced a different reality. His small stove, a simple iron box, was fed with a quiet regularity. He did not need a roaring inferno. He needed only a steady, gentle heat. The moss-packed logs did not breathe the wind. The small windows, triple-glazed with panes he had painstakingly sealed, showed only the clear, cold sky, not the crystalline tracery of failure that grew on his neighbor's glass. And the Seine worked. To leave, he would step into the small, still chamber. The air inside it was cold, but it was a dead, motionless cold. He would pull his coat from a wooden peg, close the inner door firmly behind him, and then open the heavy outer door. The wind would hit him, a physical blow, but the warmth of the cabin remained untouched, protected by the inner door and the insulating buffer of air. When he returned, stamping the snow from his boots on the stone floor of the Seine, the process was reversed. He would step into the calm, close the fury of the storm behind him, and only then, in that pocket of stillness, would he open the door to his home. A small, almost imperceptible whisper of cool air might greet him, but it was a sigh, not a scream. The warmth was safe. The vow was kept. He was consuming half the wood of his neighbors. His mornings were not a frantic, shivering race to rekindle a dying fire, but a calm routine of adding a few small logs to the glowing bed of coals that had lasted through the night. The heat, once created, stayed. It saturated the thick wooden walls, the insulated ceiling, the very air itself. It was a pool of warmth in an ocean of cold, and its shores were inviolate. January 12th, 1888. The day began with a strange, unsettling mildness. The sky was a hazy, leaden gray. The temperature hovered just below freezing. Settlers who had been confined to their cabins for weeks took the opportunity to visit neighbors, check on livestock. The children, released from their stuffy prisons, ran shouting in the snow. There was an almost festive air. Elias felt no joy. He saw the strange color of the sky. He felt the unnatural stillness of the air, a silence that felt like a held breath. He recognized this peace. It was the calm that comes before the true war. His grandfather had called it a ulvetid, a wolf's time, when the world smiles before it shows its teeth. He spent the morning not socializing, but securing his world. He brought in extra wood, not a frantic pile, but a neat, orderly stack. He filled every container with water from his well. He checked the seal on his doors, running a calloused finger along the line of rabbit fur. He cooked a large pot of stew, filling the small cabin with the rich scent of meat and root vegetables. He was preparing not for a storm, but for a siege. Around midday, it began. A low, mournful sound from the northwest. A sound that was not wind, but the approach of wind. The sky darkened with an astonishing speed. The temperature began to plummet. It did not fall, it collapsed. Within an hour, it dropped 30 degrees, then 40, then 50. The mild morning was a distant, mocking memory. Then the snow came. It did not fall in flakes, but in a horizontal, blinding sheet of white. It was as fine as flour and as sharp as sand, driven by a wind that rose to a terrifying, shrieking howl. Visibility dropped to zero. The world vanished. There was only the cabin and the screaming white void that surrounded it. The school children's blizzard. The Great White Death. It would be given many names later, but for those caught in it, it had only one: the end. Inside his cabin, Elias sat at his small table, reading a worn Bible by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The wind hammered at the walls, a relentless, percussive assault. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure on the ears. But inside, the air was still. The flame of his lamp did not flicker. The low, steady heat from the stove wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. He was a stone in the heart of a maelstrom, and he was at peace. 300 yards away, in the finest house in Providence, Jedediah Thorne was fighting a losing battle. The wind, a thing of impossible force, had found every tiny imperfection in his craft. It screamed through the keyhole. It forced its way around the window sashes, piling fine, sharp snow on the interior sills. The great oak door, his masterpiece, was bowing inward, a fine spray of ice jetting from its top and bottom edges. The stove was a ravenous god, demanding sacrifice. They had already burned a full day's supply of wood in just a few hours. The temperature inside the main room, despite the roaring fire, was now below freezing. His wife, Mary, had moved the children into their single bedroom, stuffing quilts and blankets against the door. But the cold was seeping in, a palpable, killing presence.
"Jedediah!" Mary's voice was thin with terror. "The wood box is almost empty!" Thorn stared at the door. The woodpile was only 20 feet away, a journey of seconds in normal weather. Now, it was a voyage across an Arctic wasteland. To open that door was to invite the monster inside. It would consume what little warmth they had left in a single, ravenous gulp. But not to open it was to freeze. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned. He pulled a thick wool scarf over his face, tied a rope around his waist, and gave the other end to Mary. "Don't let go," he commanded. He took a deep breath and threw the bolt. The door was ripped from his grasp and slammed open against the interior wall. The storm entered. It was not air. It was a solid wall of white, a force that knocked him back. The heat in the room vanished. The fire in the stove seemed to shrink and cower, the flames turning a sickly blue. Snow filled the room, coating everything in a layer of instant, glittering frost. Mary screamed as the rope was nearly pulled from her numb fingers. Thorn fought his way out into the white nothingness, staggering toward the woodpile he could not see. He found it by touch, his hands raw and clumsy with cold. He gathered an armload of frozen logs and turned back, following the lifeline of the rope. It took him an eternity to fight his way back inside, to throw his body against the door and force it shut against the god of the wind. He collapsed on the floor, gasping, his beard a solid mask of ice. The wood he had retrieved was covered in snow and would barely burn. And the warmth was gone. The room was now as cold as the world outside. The stove was no longer a source of heat, but a monument to their failure. Despair, colder than any wind, settled in his heart. They were going to die. In his own, perfectly built home, surrounded by his family, they were going to freeze to death. And then, a thought surfaced through the fog of his fear, a strange, ridiculous thought. He thought of the fool on the edge of town, the quiet Norwegian, Lund. He pictured the strange, boxy entrance, the double doors, the wasted wood, the folly. He had two choices. He could stay here and die with his pride in the cold tomb of his own expertise, or he could face the storm one more time on the slimmest, most insane chance that the fool's folly was something more. He felt a sudden, burning shame that was almost warm. He had mocked the man. He had led the chorus of ridicule. To go to him now was to admit a failure so profound it would rewrite his entire life. "Mary," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Keep the children moving. Huddle together. I have to go out." "No, Jedediah! You can't! You'll die!" "We'll die if I stay," he said, his voice grim. He looked at the faces of his children, pinched and blue with cold. That was all the motivation he needed. Pride was a luxury for the warm. He was a desperate man. He did not take the rope this time. There was no one to hold the other end. He simply opened the door and plunged into the shrieking chaos, aiming himself in the direction of the Lund claim. He moved by instinct,
by a builder's sense of distance and direction. The wind tore at him, tried to trip him, tried to scour the breath from his lungs. He fell, he crawled, he rose again. He was guided by a single, flickering image in his mind, the image of a warm cabin. He no longer cared if it was his or another's. He thought he was lost, that he was crawling in circles, when he saw it, a light. It was not a bright light, but a small, steady, impossibly calm yellow square in the maelstrom of white. It was Elias Lund's window. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He stumbled toward it, falling against the cabin wall. He felt his way along the rough-hewn logs until his frozen hands found the frame of the outer door. He banged on it with what little strength he had left, his fist making a dull, pathetic thud against the thick wood. He shouted, but his voice was stolen by the wind. He banged again, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He was expecting to find a man as cold and desperate as himself. Or worse, to find a frozen corpse. The door swung open, outwards, smoothly, with no resistance from the wind. Elias Lund stood there, silhouetted against the dim light from within. He was not wrapped in furs. He was in his shirt sleeves. Thorn fell forward, collapsing into the small, enclosed space of the Seine. Elias caught him, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him fully inside. Then he closed the heavy outer door, and the world went silent. The raging, screaming howl of the blizzard was gone, muted to a distant, irrelevant rumble. Thorn was in a small, dark, and cold space. But it was a still cold, a dead cold. There was no wind. He looked up at Elias, his mind struggling to comprehend the sudden peace. Elias said nothing. He simply turned and opened the inner door. It was not a blast of air that hit Thorn. It was a presence, a gentle, solid wave of warmth. It was the smell of wood smoke, baking bread, and hot stew. Thorn crawled, pushed by some primal instinct, through the inner doorway and collapsed onto the floor of the cabin proper. The warmth was everywhere. It was in the floorboards beneath him, in the air he was breathing. It was a deep, penetrating, life-giving heat. He looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the lamp. The stove was not roaring, it was purring, a low, contented rumble. On the table, next to the Bible, sat a loaf of freshly baked bread. On the stove, the pot of stew simmered. Elias Lund was not just surviving, he was living. The fool was not a fool. He was a prophet. Elias helped Thorn to a chair, removed his ice-caked coat, and handed him a steaming mug of coffee. Thorn's hands shook so badly he could barely hold it. He took a sip, the hot liquid a shock to his frozen system. He looked at the calm, quiet Norwegian, and a wave of shame so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. My family, Thorn stammered, his lips clumsy and numb. Mary, the children, they're freezing. Our wood, it's gone. Elias simply nodded. He pulled on his own heavy coat, grabbed a coil of rope from a peg, and looked at Thorn. Show me the way. The journey back was a strange pilgrimage. Elias, leading with the rope, seemed untroubled by the storm. He moved with a steady, relentless purpose. They brought Thorn's family back, one by one, carrying the two small children wrapped in blankets. Each time they entered the cabin, the ritual was the same. Into the Seine, close the outer door, stamp the snow, shed the cold, open the inner door, step into warmth.
The sanctuary remained inviolate.
Soon, Thorn's family was huddled by the stove, wrapped in Elias's blankets, sipping hot stew. The children's blue lips were turning pink again. Mary Thorne looked around the small, warm room, then at Elias, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe that mirrored her husband's. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. During that time, Elias's folly became an ark. Guided by Thorn, who could no longer bear the thought of his neighbors freezing while he sat in this impossible warmth, they brought 2 other families to the cabin. The family of the store owner, Mr. Hemlock, whose windows had burst from the pressure of the wind, and the family of Silas, Thorn's young apprentice, whose hastily built cabin had begun to come apart. The small space was crowded, but it was alive. They shared the food Elias had prepared, they slept in shifts on the floor, and all the while, the stove purred, the lamp burned without a flicker, and the storm hammered uselessly against the walls of the wisest house in the Dakotas. On the 3rd day, the wind died. The silence it left behind was as profound as the noise had been. When Elias opened the outer door of the Seine, it revealed a world transformed. It was a landscape of impossible, sculptural beauty, buried under 15 feet of snow, glistening under a brilliant, cold sun. In the weeks that followed, the full toll of the storm became known. Families who had run out of wood, men lost in the whiteout between house and barn. The settlement of Providence was a place of mourning, but it was also a place of wonder. The story of Lund's Folly, the cabin that had become an ark, spread from survivor to survivor. One morning in early spring, as the great drifts of snow were beginning to shrink and the prairie was reappearing, Jedediah Thorne appeared at Elias's door. He was alone. He did not knock. He simply stood, hat in hand, waiting. Elias opened the inner door, then the outer door, and stood before him. Thorne did not meet his eyes. He stared at the ground, at the worn toes of his boots. "Lund," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I did not come to thank you. Thank you is a word for small favors. I came to say that I was wrong." He finally looked up, and Elias saw in the master builder's eyes a humility he had never seen before. "Everything I knew about building, everything I have ever taught, was wrong. I built with pride. You built with wisdom. I built against the winter. You built with it. I called this folly." He reached out and laid a hand on the solid frame of the Seine. "I was the fool. This is the smartest thing I have ever seen." He paused, swallowing hard. "I am asking you, Elias, teach me. Teach me how to build this." Elias looked at the man who had led the chorus of his humiliation. He saw no triumph in his victory, only a shared understanding of the stakes. He nodded. That spring, the sounds of construction returned to Providence. But they were different sounds. They were the sounds of men digging foundations for the Seine, the sounds of careful, precise notching. The scent of pine was now mingled with the earthy smell of sphagnum moss. Elias Lund, the quiet outsider, became the teacher. He spoke little, demonstrating with his hands, with the quiet authority of lived knowledge. He taught them how to read the grain of the wood, how to understand the movement of air, how to respect the power of the cold by giving it a place to wait. The new cabins that rose in Providence all had the distinctive, box-like entrance. They were called Lund houses at first, then later, as Thorne insisted on giving credit where it was due, Elias entries. The design spread across the territory, passed from builder to builder, a piece of old world wisdom taking root in the new world soil. The double door system, born of grief and memory in the mountains of Norway, became the standard, a quiet, unassuming innovation that saved countless lives in the brutal winters that followed. Elias Lund never lost his silence. He never became a loud or boastful man. He did not need to. His legacy was not in words, but in the warm, safe homes that dotted the prairie. It was in the flicker-free flame of a lamp on a stormy night. It was in the sound of children's laughter, echoing from within a cabin that no longer feared the winter. It was in the simple, profound truth that he had known all along, that the greatest strength is not found in fighting the storm, but in understanding how to welcome it, and then, gently, closing the door.